We are making America great again. Tonight, after 11 months, our border is secure. Inflation is stopped. Wages are up. Prices are down. Our nation is strong. America is respected. And our country is back, stronger than ever before. We're poised for an economic boom, the likes of which the world has never seen. Soon we will host the World Cup and the Olympics, both of which I got. But most importantly, we will celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. There could be no more fitting tribute to this epic milestone than to complete the comeback of America that began just 1 year ago. When the world looks at us next year, let them see a nation that is loyal to its citizens, faithful to its workers, confident to its identity, certain to its destiny, and the envy of the entire globe. We are respected again like we have never been respected before. To each and every one of you, have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. God bless you all.
I'm struggling, frankly, to characterize that speech. It was a lot of stuff, a lot of points that he made, and we have two Chris's that are going to help work through it. CBC's Chris Reyes is watching the speech from New York City, and Chris Galdieri is a professor of political science at St. Anselm College, and he is in New Hampshire. Chris Reyes, let's start with you, and I want each of you maybe to give me a short answer to this before we move on in the conversation. Your top-of-mind reaction to what we just heard.
Well, I mean, the first thought is that he didn't talk about Venezuela. He didn't talk about foreign policy. He talked about affordability, pressed the gas on that, and then went all the way throughout the speech. The other thing that came to mind, Ian, is that I was at the Republican National Convention when Trump begged officially the nomination for his party, and he seemed to be channeling a lot of what he said in that speech. And what's important to note there is at that time, the mania for Trump was at peak levels, and he seems to be going back to that, reminding Americans why they voted for him in the first place.
Chris Galdieri, your sort of top-of-mind impression of what we just heard.
I thought it was flailing and desperate. Trump has had a really difficult run lately since the government shutdown, the off-year elections last month, the vote on the Epstein files. And it really just seems like he took all of his greatest hits, threw them in the blender, put the blender on the teleprompter, and read what came out very, very quickly. It was one of the strangest speeches I think an American president has ever given.
Yeah, and Chris Galdieri, and I'll mention your full names because we happen to have two Chris's live on the air at the same time. Chris Galdieri, as you listen to what Donald Trump says, I'll tell you one of the things that strikes me, but for you in the United States, I think you have a clearer sense of this. I don't know how many people are going to have listened to the entire 18 or 19 minutes. Most people, I think, are going to get their coverage of this via social media, via cable networks. I feel like Fox's coverage of this is going to be completely different from CNN's coverage. But what's your sense of that?
I do think that's right. And, we're in such a fragmented media environment. With a speech like this, you'll see, a line picked out here, a line picked out there. But what struck me is that there was really nothing uniting this. He presented this as something of a victory lap coming up on his first year since he returned to office. But, there was nothing holding it together. It was just, incorrect statistics about crime, false claims about immigration, the idea that somehow illegal immigrants are taking all of the housing. It was just weird. It was a very strange speech. I don't know who the audience for this was, and I honestly don't know what the takeaway points for it were. I don't think Trump did himself much good with this, and I certainly don't think that whoever put this together for him served his interests at all well.
And Chris Reyes, as a reporter for CBC, you have less latitude in kind of giving your interpretation of this. But I think it is important for us to talk about a few things here. One is the tone about immigrants, kind of equating immigration with criminals coming across the border, talking about protecting jobs for U.S.-born citizens as opposed to immigrants who are U.S. citizens. The comments about Somalis, which I just can't imagine a Canadian politician, a major Canadian politician, making those kinds of comments, or if they did, surviving making those kinds of comments politically. But Chris Reyes, again, you're in the United States. Tell me a little bit about how that sat with you to hear the president talking about immigrants that way.
Again, we've heard all of these things before, and that's why, I bring up the Republican National Convention, because this is a lot of what I heard from Trump during that gathering. This speaks directly to his base, and what the speech sounded to me it is a stump speech ahead of the midterm elections. And remember, we talked about the backdrop of this speech. He's got some of the lowest approval rating of this year that we're seeing coming out of some polls. You've got some 2/3 of Americans in some surveys saying that they don't trust him with the economy, which was a defining platform in his campaign that helped him win that election. And the reason why the first word that I brought up was affordability is that I covered the election here in New York, in which a Democratic socialist won in the capital center of not just this country, but the world, running entirely on an agenda of affordability. And we saw that shocking meeting between Trump and Zoran Mamdani, in which Trump seemed to admire his, at the very least, his charisma. And since that meeting, all you hear across U.S. media when talking about the issues that matter to Americans, you only hear one word. You hear affordability. And I want to bring back that article that cost shockwaves that was given by Susie Wiles. And there's a section there that's not as talked about as the other headlines, in which Susie Wiles advised the president to talk more about kitchen table issues rather than foreign policy, rather than Saudi Arabia. And this speech to me sounded like he was listening to that advice. It was entirely about the economy. He said wages are up. He talked about healthcare becoming more affordable. He talked about this check of $1,700 going to military soldiers before Christmas. A big announcement. Talked about wages are up, country is back, the border is secure. It sounded to me like he's campaigning all over again, and that makes sense given that the midterm elections are coming up next year, and in the elections that happened just in November, where you had elections in California and in New Jersey and here in New York, Democrats swept those races, and it was a bellwether for how people felt about the economy.
We're live here on CBC News Network. President Donald Trump speaking just a little earlier on in this hour. And in less than 3 minutes, we'll be rejoining the National here on CBC News Network. So Chris Galdieri, professor of political science, let's finish with you. Right at the beginning of the speech, I guess, Trump set the tone, blamed the Biden administration, talked about affordability, talked about criminals coming across the border. And then the third thing he talked about is men playing women's sports. It was a mix of kind of his economic message, his immigration message, but also his ideological message as well. And so in the remaining 2 minutes, Chris Galtieri, how about a final word from you on what we heard from Donald Trump?
Well, what strikes me overall is that this is the sort of thing we've seen presidents do in the past, give a big Oval Office speech in an attempt to sort of reset the conversation when things aren't going very well for them. And historically, the record suggests that this is not a successful tactic. Think back to Jimmy Carter and what became known as the malaise speech around the midpoint of his presidency, that we remember as a speech where Carter tried to reset the conversation, tried to get people to look at his presidency in a different light, and it didn't work. I think the danger politically that Trump faces is that folks have made up their minds about him. A lot of folks voted for him, again, on the affordability issue that we've been talking about. But people know that prices have not really gone down that much. People know that the price of gas is not that much different than it was a year ago. And I think to the extent that Trump is trying to convince people that the economy is better than it is, or is better than their actual experiences of going to the hardware store, going to the grocery store, I think he is courting trouble. And I think that is the root cause of his low approval ratings almost a year into his second term.
Yeah, although in a polarized America, I guess we'll see whether the reaction to this speech will be polarized as well. Some people perhaps cheering it on and some people just shaking their heads in dismay. Chris Galderi, political science professor, joining us from New Hampshire tonight. Chris Reyes, CBC reporter in New York City. Thanks to both of you.